This is not a story about a small nation's heroic last stand against impossible odds. The kind of story popular memory tends to flatten every underdog military victory into, regardless of the actual mechanics involved. It is the story of a single tactic, improvised in the field by men who had never specifically trained for it, that turned entire Soviet divisions into frozen corpses along a single narrow road, and the Soviet general whose own official death sentence read, absurdly, as the loss of 55 field kitchens rather than the loss of an entire 17,000-man division under his own command. This is the story of the Motti, the Finnish tactic that humiliated Joseph Stalin's own Red Army during the Winter War, a country of 3 million people fighting off an invasion by a nation of more than 100 million, and doing it with a technique nobody had actually written into any Finnish training manual before the war itself began that same winter. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the tactics that made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The Soviet Union invaded Finland on November the 30th, 1939, expecting a swift, largely uncontested victory against a military force a fraction the size of the invading Red Army, an assumption Soviet planners held with a confidence that would prove badly misplaced within weeks of the fighting actually beginning. Stalin's own planners committed more than 450,000 troops to the invasion, facing a Finnish army that could field barely 180,000 men in total, equipped with only limited armor and artillery compared to the mechanized force advancing against them across the entire length of the shared border. In the country's central sector, near the small logging town of Suomussalmi, a settlement of barely 4,000 loggers, hunters, and their own families, that overwhelming Soviet numerical advantage ran directly into a Finnish military improvisation nobody on either side had specifically planned for before the fighting actually began that November. Soviet forces advancing towards Suomussalmi, intending to cut Finland in two at the Gulf of Bothnia and force the country's surrender by splitting it entirely into two isolated halves, neither of which could realistically continue resisting alone, found themselves funneled onto narrow forest roads that offered no realistic alternative route through the region's own dense frozen wilderness, stretching for miles in every direction. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo's 9th Division, composed largely of reservists drawn from the same forests they were now defending, possessed an intimate, practical knowledge of that terrain and genuine skill on skis that let small, mobile units move through deep snow considerably faster than the road-bound Soviet columns they were about to face, an advantage born directly out of these same men's own civilian lives as loggers and hunters rather than any formal military training program. Recognizing that the Soviet advance depended entirely on those same narrow roads, since the surrounding forests and frozen lakes offered Soviet vehicles and heavy equipment no realistic alternative path forward, Finnish commanders developed, largely through improvisation under actual combat pressure rather than any pre-war doctrine, a tactic that came to be known as the Motti, the Finnish word for a bundle or cord of cut firewood, a name that captured exactly what the tactic actually did to an enemy force, cutting a single, long, vulnerable column into smaller, isolated pieces that could then be surrounded and destroyed one section at a time, precisely the way a woodsman reduces a single tree into a manageable stack of individual logs. Before we get into how that single tactic actually destroyed two entire Soviet divisions in barely a month of fighting, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Finnish forces brought more to this specific fight than terrain knowledge and mobility alone, though those two factors mattered enormously to the tactic's own eventual success. Finnish infantry carried the Suomi submachine gun in meaningful numbers, a weapon offering considerably greater close-range firepower per soldier than the bolt-action rifles that still equipped much of the advancing Soviet infantry, a genuine equipment advantage in exactly the kind of close, sudden ambush engagements the Motti tactic actually required to work. Finnish troops also dressed almost entirely in white camouflage suited to the snow-covered terrain, rendering ski patrols nearly invisible against the winter landscape until the moment they actually chose to strike. while many Soviet soldiers advanced in standard olive uniforms that stood out starkly against the same white backdrop, a visual disadvantage that cost Soviet units dearly in an environment where visibility itself functioned as a genuine tactical asset or liability, depending on which side actually controlled it. The Motti tactic worked through patient, methodical execution rather than any single dramatic assault, a process that required real-time and careful preparation to actually pull off successfully against a numerically superior opponent. Finnish ski troops, moving quickly and quietly through terrain Soviet forces found nearly impassable without skis of their own, would strike at multiple points along a strung-out Soviet column simultaneously, cutting the road at several locations and splitting a single division into a series of smaller, isolated pockets that could no longer support or reinforce each other across the increasingly fragmented length of what had originally been a single continuous force. Once a pocket had been cut off from the rest of its own column, cold, hunger, and constant harassing fire did much of the remaining work. Soviet troops trapped without adequate winter clothing, without resupply, and without any realistic path of retreat, gradually succumbing to exposure and starvation, as much as to direct combat losses inflicted by Finnish rifles and submachine guns. The tactic depended on specific conditions that would not have worked against every enemy in every circumstance, requiring an opponent already strung out along a single, vulnerable road rather than deployed in a more dispersed formation, and requiring Finnish forces to temporarily surrender territory around that road in order to actually execute the encirclement, a genuine trade-off Finnish commanders accepted deliberately given the alternative of trying to hold a continuous defensive line against a considerably larger invading force that would have overwhelmed any such static defense within days. The Soviet 63rd Rifle Division became the Motti's first major victim in the Suomussalmi sector, effectively destroyed as an organized fighting force within days of the tactic's own systematic application against its own strung-out column. The Soviet High Command, unwilling to accept the defeat or reconsider the underlying assumptions that had produced it, committed the 44th Rifle Division, a considerably larger and better regarded formation of roughly 17,000 troops drawn substantially from Ukraine, to relieve the trapped survivors and continue the original advance toward Oulu, regardless of what had just happened to the division sent in ahead of it only days earlier. That division advanced directly into the same trap, its own column stretched for miles along the narrow Raate Road, in temperatures reaching 30 degrees below zero, many of its own soldiers lacking adequate winter clothing or skis of any kind despite the obvious climate they were being sent to fight in, dependent entirely on trucks and horse-drawn transport that bogged down repeatedly in the deep snow and left the column dangerously exposed for exactly the kind of attack Finnish forces had already perfected against its predecessor days earlier along the exact same stretch of road. The decisive assault against the 44th Division began on January the 5th, 1940. Finnish forces, outnumbered by a margin of roughly 4-1 even at this second engagement, cutting the Soviet column into isolated pockets at multiple points along the Raate Road, simultaneously and systematically reducing each pocket over the following 2 days of brutal winter fighting, conducted largely in darkness and sub-zero temperatures that punished both sides equally. By the time organized Soviet resistance in the sector finally collapsed, Finnish forces had inflicted casualties. Historians now generally estimate at somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 Soviet dead, alongside more than 1,000 prisoners captured, against total Finnish losses across the entire battle of roughly 310 killed, a casualty ratio that stunned military observers on every side of the wider European conflict already gathering elsewhere across the continent. Finnish forces captured substantial quantities of abandoned Soviet equipment in the aftermath, including dozens of tanks, hundreds of trucks, and dozens of artillery pieces, material advantages that would prove genuinely useful to Finland's own continued war effort in the weeks that followed, effectively re-equipping several Finnish units with captured Soviet hardware their own limited domestic industry could never have produced in comparable quantity. The Soviet High Command's own response to the disaster fell hardest on the man who had commanded the 44th Division through its own destruction, a search for a single culpable individual that reflected the Soviet military justice system's own broader tendency to demand a personal scapegoat for institutional failures rather than examine the underlying doctrine and planning that had actually produced the disaster in the first place. General Alexei Vinogradov, who had reportedly escaped the battlefield himself aboard a commandeered tank, while much of his own division remained trapped and dying along the Raate Road behind him, was arrested on the direct order of Lev Meklis, a senior Soviet political official sent specifically to investigate how two entire divisions had been destroyed by a considerably smaller Finnish force in barely a month of fighting. Meklis himself carried a fearsome reputation within the Soviet military and political apparatus as an unforgiving enforcer of Stalin's own expectations, a reputation that meant Vinogradov's own fate was likely sealed the moment Meklis was assigned to investigate the sector at all, regardless of what any more measured inquiry into the actual causes of the defeat might eventually have concluded about broader institutional failures in Soviet winter warfare doctrine and equipment. A summary military tribunal convicted Vinogradov, alongside his own chief of staff, Colonel Onufry Volkov, and the division's political commissar, and on January the 11th, 1940, he was executed by firing squad in front of the roughly 700 surviving members of his own division who had actually made it back to Soviet lines, a deliberately public execution intended to demonstrate the consequence of failure to every remaining soldier watching. The tribunal's own official record of the charge against him astonishingly cited the irrecoverable loss of 55 field kitchens as the specific offense justifying his execution, a bureaucratic absurdity that reduced the destruction of an entire 17,000-man division to a single-line item about lost cooking equipment, whether through genuine institutional confusion about how to formally charge a general for a battlefield catastrophe of that scale, or through the Soviet military justice system's own grim indifference to the actual scale of what it was punishing, treating the loss of thousands of human lives as functionally interchangeable with the loss of military property on an official charge sheet. The same broader conditions that made the Motti tactic possible, dense forest terrain, extreme cold, and Finnish soldiers fighting on ground they had known since childhood, also produced the individual soldier whose own wartime reputation would eventually eclipse even the Motti's own tactical fame in popular memory. Simo Heiha, a Finnish marksman fighting in a different sector of the same war, became credited with hundreds of confirmed kills using an iron-sighted rifle rather than any telescopic scope, a reputation that earned him the nickname White Death among the same Soviet forces struggling elsewhere along the front. A single individual's own story that has, in the decades since, often overshadowed the considerably larger-scale tactical achievement the Motti itself represented across an entire theater of the war rather than a single marksman's own individual record. The disaster at Suomussalmi and along the Raate Road formed only one part of a considerably wider pattern of Soviet military embarrassment across the entire length of the Winter War, a conflict that ultimately cost the Red Army casualties historians now generally estimate in the range of 120,000 to 170,000 dead against Finnish losses of roughly 25,000, a lopsided casualty ratio that shocked international observers who had generally expected the vastly larger Soviet military to overwhelm Finnish resistance within weeks rather than months. On the Karelian Isthmus further south, the Mannerheim Line, a network of Finnish fortifications considerably less elaborate than its own popular wartime reputation suggested, absorbed repeated Soviet assaults for months before Soviet forces finally broke through in February of 1940, achieving that breakthrough only after the Red Army had substantially reorganized its own tactics, replaced ineffective commanders, and committed considerably greater resources than its original invasion plan had ever anticipated needing against a nation with barely 3% of its own total population. This is not a story about Finnish courage alone overcoming impossible material odds, a framing that risks obscuring the specific, disciplined, tactical thinking that actually made the difference on the ground at Suomussalmi and along the Raate Road, reducing a genuine feat of applied military improvisation to a simpler, more sentimental story about national resolve alone. It is a story about how a single tactic, developed under real combat pressure by men defending their own home terrain rather than handed down from any pre-war military academy, could turn an enemy's own overwhelming numerical advantage into a fatal liability, transforming long road-bound columns that should have represented crushing strength into a series of isolated freezing traps, one narrow forest road at a time, a reversal that depended entirely on Finnish commanders correctly reading the specific terrain and logistical constraints their own numerically superior enemy could not actually escape. The Motti's own reputation has long outlived the specific war that produced it, and outlived, too, most of the men on both sides who actually fought through it that brutal winter. Military historian William Trotter has written that the victories won through the tactic proved so impressive that the Battle of Suomussalmi is still taught today as a genuine tactical masterpiece at the United States Military Academy at West Point and at Britain's own Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, an enduring legacy for a technique that, by Trotter's own research, appears nowhere in Finland's actual pre-war training curriculum, a tactic invented essentially on the spot by outnumbered men who simply understood their own terrain better than the army trying to cross it, and who turned that understanding into one of the most studied small unit tactical achievements of the entire 20th century, almost by necessity rather than by any long premeditated design. Finland itself, despite the tactical brilliance on display at Suomussalmi and elsewhere along the front, ultimately signed a peace treaty in March of 1940 that ceded roughly 10% of its own pre-war territory to the Soviet Union, a reminder that even the most devastating tactical victories could not, on their own, fully offset the underlying strategic imbalance between a nation of 3 million people and one of more than 100 million, however humiliating individual battles like Suomussalmi had proven for the larger of the two combatants along that single frozen road. If you want more stories about the tactics invented under pressure that outlasted the wars that produced them, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.